Thank you, Chloe. Just want to make sure everyone can see and hear me. More importantly, hear me. Let me just wait for the slides to get loaded up. We've tested this, so it should work smoothly. I think famous last words there. Oh, here we go. That looks quite positive. It's the right slide deck. That's always a good start. So thank you, Chloe, for her generous invitation to inviting me to this talk to speak to you, some of the alumni here. It's good to see people from far and near, all over Scotland and other parts of the world. So obviously appreciate your time and interest in my research here. And it's good to see some old and new friends also from the IR and especially strategic studies department there, which I'm obviously actively involved in. So in terms of the talk so far, this is discussing my more newish book launch, AI and the Bomb. Don't be scared off by the title. There are some caveats, and I'll try and end on a reasonably positive note as well. And obviously, I do apologize in advance for any kind of unashamed self-promotion or excessive use of military jargon during the presentation, which some of my students are quite used to by this stage. Anything that is unclear in the talk, I can obviously clarify in the Q&A session. Okay, so by way of context, this book, AI and the Bomb, is the second of 3 books I've written on AI and warfare. The first, AI and Future Warfare, considers some of the more tactical features of military use AI, especially in the context of US-China stability. The most recent volume, catchily titled The AI Commander, this examines more the ethical, political, and some philosophical dilemmas associated with human-machine interaction or interfaces in hybrid teaming military operations. So taken kind of holistically, these books provide a kind of theoretically grounded and empirically nuanced and up-to-date critique of this notion of synthesizing man and machine in future algorithmic warfare, especially considered under the nuclear shadow. And I will provide some links to these books in the chat as well. If you guys have access to the university library, most of these books are available now, either hard copy or ebook, and most of those are available free as well to students. Okay, so in this talk, I will begin by outlining some of my core arguments and themes from AI and the Bomb. Next, I'll briefly unpack 2 of the themes discussed in this book, namely nuclear deterrence and catalytic nuclear war. These are designed to illustrate some of the risks posed by AI to the nuclear enterprise. And then I'll close out with some brief discussion on policy implications of this research, and hopefully leaving some time for some comments and Q&A. So in a nutshell, the book explores the impact of AI on some of the critical linkages between the gritty reality of war at a very tactical grassroots level and strategic affairs, especially in consideration of nuclear doctrine and strategic planning. The famous military strategist Colin Gray, in his rebuttal of the tendency of scholars to kind of bifurcate advanced weaponry into tactical and strategic kind of conceptual buckets, he noted that all weapons are tactical in their employment, but have very obvious strategic effects. The book argues that AI-enabled weapons are no exception to this rule. Now, an overarching question considered in the book is whether the gradual adoption of AI in the context of this broader digital information ecosystem will increase or decrease states' resort to nuclear use, which I call in the book captionally the AI nuclear dilemma. So the book's central thesis has 2 folds. First, some of these rapid advances as we're seeing in AI and this broader class of disruptive emerging technology, things like hypersonic weapons, cyber warfare, etc., are transforming how we conceptualize and thus manage technology and the risk of nuclear use. Secondly, while remaining cognizant of the potential benefits of innovation, complexity, information distortion, and decision-making compression associated with AI. It also can possibly exacerbate tensions between adversaries, quote unquote, and create new mechanisms and novel threats that increase the risk of nuclear escalation, especially accidental and inadvertent use of nuclear weapons. Now, to unpack these challenges, the book applies Cold War era cornerstone nuclear theorizing, namely nuclear deterrence, strategic stability, the security dilemma, inadvertent escalation, and catalytic nuclear war, to examine the impact of introducing AI into the nuclear domain. So this theoretical framework moves beyond the kind of conventional precepts and assumptions that have been largely associated with bipolarity, symmetrical or kind of balanced state-centric world politics associated with the Cold War, and classical rational-based deterrence that surprisingly still dominates the literature. The book argues that this prevailing wisdom is misguided in the context of asymmetric nuclear armed dyads, nihilistic non-state actors, think here of proxy state actors, terrorists, etc., and increasingly non-human actors or intelligent machines. So let's look firstly at the first research thread, the impact of AI-enabled weapons on nuclear deterrence. And I think more broadly, deterrence in a military context as a whole. So this theme speaks to this nascent so-called fifth wave of modern deterrence. And these waves are illustrated on several academic pieces that I can also put in the chat. And these waves represent a conceptual break from classical deterrence theorizing. And it also, importantly for this book, introduces the notion of the role of non-human agents into state deterrent calculations. So at its very core, deterrence, for those of you who are not familiar, whether it be in the military domain or the non-military domain, is about influencing an adversary's or an enemy's sense of risk, cost-benefit analysis, decision-making outcomes. And thus it requires a very deep understanding of the other side's interests, priorities, objectives, and above all, I argue, their perceptions. Deterrence and bargaining at a strategic level can fail between rational actors in asymmetric or imbalanced information situations where incentives exist to manipulate this information, where credible commitments are problematic, and where divergences or polarizations exist on key policy issues. Now, to be sure, you're probably all aware that these conditions are all dialed up and amplified in the digital age. So a key finding from the book is that AI and autonomy can undermine deterrence between adversaries in several ways, including making it easier to find states' nuclear assets, things like mobile missile launchers and nuclear armed submarines, attacking nuclear command and control systems, or NC3, as I refer to them going forward, with AI enhanced cyber weapons, and using drones possibly going forward in swarm tactics, in preemptive strikes against nuclear deterrent assets, thinking here of things like early warning systems, antennas, sensors, and air intakes. This chart, and again, I can make these diagrams available to you all, shows AI applications that are either being tested, developed, or in an increasing number of cases, already deployed and operated within the nuclear deterrence architecture, including, for example, early warning systems, intelligence, surveillance, and recon apparatus, command and control systems, precision strike or missile strike guidance and delivery systems, and other so-called non-nuclear deterrence options, thinking here of things like cyber weapons, missile defense, and counter space weapons. So a question, or one of the questions posed in this chapter, is that how might delegating decisions to machines affect deterrence? And I guess broadly, is delegating decisions at a nuclear level or a tactical level even advisable, something we should be considering? During a crisis or conflict conditions, the deterrent effect of AI, much like other capabilities, is very much determined on its perceived risks that are associated with a particular capability it enables or enhances. So the higher the uncertainty generated by a particular capability, employing or deploying these capabilities into a crisis can very easily encourage an adversary to act more cautiously, thereby increasing its deterrent effect. So somewhat counterintuitively, states may view further automation of NC3 or nuclear systems as a way to manage and bolster deterrence. That is to say, signaling to an adversary that an attack or even a threat of an attack might trigger a nuclear response, and therefore will perhaps endanger caution or prudence by the adversary. So put differently, there's kind of a prima facie argument here that exists that building automated response mechanisms, that is, mechanisms that can automatically launch nuclear weapons without human interference or human supervision into these systems, might reverse the logical paradox inherent with rational-based classical or this Cold War era deterrence theories. That is premised on this mutual assured distraction or MAD and the will to retaliate, thereby ensuring mutual vulnerability between states and actually improving stability. However, the book argues that because of the difficulty of demonstrating a posture like this before a crisis kicks off, this kind of implicit threat, which is akin to, if you remember, Dr. Strangelove's Doomsday mystery on steroids, which I argue will more likely worsen crisis stability. Now, while AI-enabled or enhanced capabilities can offer militaries major offensive as well as defensive advantages, if they are unable to demonstrate this kind of capacity to others, especially in unequal or asymmetric situations, this will very unlikely promote stability and peace. For example, during the Cold War, strategic relations between the US and the Soviets improved from the 1970s, in part because at this stage, both sides possessed reconnaissance satellites which were able to track the other's weapons development. So that is to say, when a kind of symmetry or balance existed on a strategic basis between two states. In short, the critical factor in this evolving deterrence dynamic is to what degree a particular technology, in this case AI, disproportionately affects states' perceptions of the balance of power. So another question the book poses is, how might mixing various levels of human to machine interaction affect deterrence between states? The confusion and uncertainty that would inevitably result from mixing various and potentially unknown levels of human and machine interaction, and then AIs reacting to events in non-human ways at machine speed, could dramatically increase inadvertent risk. For example, there was a recent defeat by a human F-16 strike fighter pilot in an AI Dartmouth-sponsored so-called Alpha Dogfight Challenge. And this virtual performance demonstrated clearly how AIs performing in complex and dynamic environments can compress decision-making and use very unorthodox, that is, non-human tactics in this high-stakes game of human to machine chicken. These kind of risks demonstrated in this virtual simulation will be further compounded by an overconfidence in the reliance on AI decision-making tools known in psychology parlance as automation bias. And this would mean, or potentially mean, that false negatives and positives go unnoticed or even potentially ignored. In the book, I argue that regardless of whether humans keep their finger on the proverbial red nuclear button, the increasing centrality of AI technology in the decision-making process as a whole, at various levels of the decision-making spectrum, will increase its influence at each stage of the decision-making loop. That is John Boyd's, if you're familiar with Colonel John Boyd's OODA loop, thereby further compressing the metaphorical escalation ladder with very uncertain and unexpected consequences. Conceptually speaking, an AI that is optimized to pursue assumed pre-programmed, that is pre-programmed by human goals and missions, might very easily misinterpret an adversary who is signaling a desire for resolution, perhaps to avoid conflict or de-escalate the situation, thus complicating the very delicate balance between an actor's willingness to escalate a situation with nuclear weapons as a very last resort, where at the same time they're looking to keep the option open to step back from the brink. In addition, machine decision-making, which is specifically designed to exploit tactical and operational advantages in a situation, may lack the so-called human theory of mind, that is, human empathy or intuition, especially in unknown or a priori situations involving humans. Not only would AIs need to understand the goals and intentions and the spirit of human commanders, but also the signaling and behavior of human and potentially their machine adversaries. This challenge is compounded by a difference in adversaries' goal setting. For example, differences in the use of force philosophy, their value alignment, their command and control structures, and the configuration of their respective human and machine interfaces. To be sure, several open questions, both philosophical and empirical, remain about how various parts of this hypothetical synergy will actually work in practice. For example, would military commanders become over-reliant on an AI, believing it to be superior at doing its own job? Or juxtaposed, might commanders distrust AI's recommendations because of its machine kind of fuzzy logic, this so-called black box problem? And how might an adversary calculate risk differently with the presence of non-human agents on the opposing side, especially, as I mentioned, in these imbalanced asymmetric situations? For example, we're seeing in the Ukrainian-Russian situation, or potentially in a skirmish between Taiwan and China, or North Korea and China and South Korea. Okay, so having considered the impact of AI on deterrence, I will now briefly introduce a second research thread. That is the risk of accidental nuclear war sparked by third-party or non-state actors, this so-called catalytic nuclear war risk. So in 2016, the AWD news site reported that Israel had threatened to attack Pakistan with nuclear weapons if Islamabad interfered in Syria. On Twitter, or now X, Pakistani defense minister reminded Israel that Pakistan was also a nuclear power. Luckily for everyone concerned, the report was debunked as a fake by the Israeli Defense Ministry. This incident, and others following that, puts a very modern and alarming spin on the concept of catalytic nuclear war, in which the absence of a third-party actor, state or non-state, provokes a nuclear war between two or more armed nuclear powers. The book revisits this, or dusts off this Cold War era concept of catalytic escalation, considered by many to be redundant or useless, given the very low probability that a terrorist group could actually gain access to nuclear materials and weapons. in the light of technological change, and especially for the purpose of this book, our improved understanding of human psychology. The book asks, how might AI tools in the hands of third-party actors drag a nuclear or an adversary into conflict? That is, how might states stumble into war given the actions of a third-party interference? The book argues that in the digital AI-enabled age, the catalytic or catalyzing chain of reaction and reaction dynamics set in chain by a third-party actor taking two or more states to a nuclear to the nuclear brink is fast becoming a plausible scenario. So in theory, a non-state actor, for example, could target a state's nuclear systems, early warning satellites and radars with AI-enhanced cyber weapons, in this case without the use for physical or kinetic force, let alone the need to possess nuclear weapons to have Tom Shelling's so-called power to hurt. While such an attack would pretty much be beyond the abilities and resources of more opportunistic or less sophisticated non-state actors, emerging technology like AI will likely lower this threshold, creating new and novel pathways to accomplish nefarious goals, especially through the manipulation and distortion of the information landscape. And this is where decision makers ultimately make their decisions. For example, things like spreading disinformation, conspiracy theories and false memes, fake news on social media. In short, AI and other emerging technologies are rapidly creating new and exacerbating old, low cost and relatively easy means for a third-party actor to pursue their goals. Now, these aggravating features, or certain aggravating features of the digital age, namely information complexity, the greater automation of nuclear systems, and mis and disinformation, will likely amplify these underlying conditions that I've highlighted, thereby increasing the risk of accidental escalation, especially during a crisis situation. So a key characteristic of modern nuclear systems is the vast quantities of data information that are collected to inform decision making. These information sources are then mined and gathered and synthesized with advanced technology, things like machine learning, big data analytics, and increasingly quantum computing. Information overload and complexity that is enmeshed or combined into nuclear systems, I argue, increases escalation risks in three critical ways. First, decision makers' dependence on data gathered or generated by complex and interdependent nuclear systems can adversely affect the quality of decision making and compromise the reliability of nuclear systems, especially, of course, when they're subject to cyber attacks. Second, decision makers overwhelmed with information might be willing to take more risk. During a crisis, for example, information asymmetry may prompt decision makers to eschew prudence for preemptive strikes, thereby increasing the risk of inadvertent escalation. In this case, it is noteworthy that social science evidence has illuminated that people's propensity for these so-called knee-jerk or fast decisions or heuristic judgments, known in the parlance as System 1 thinking, is increased when information overload and unfamiliar technologies are prominent features of decision making. Thirdly, the complexity and uncertainty introduced by the increasing automation of nuclear systems, especially early warning satellites and radars to support intelligence missions, raises a strong possibility of errors, both human and machine, unexpected interactions, and unintended consequences. These risks, albeit during peacetime were illustrated in the 2017 NotPetya attack by Russian hackers. In this case, while Ukraine was the intended target, the fallout spread rapidly globally. The recent historical record, especially during and after the Cold War, is replete with examples of nuclear false alarms, accidents, a sloppy use, or protocols involved in nuclear weapons, and other risks associated with increasingly complex, porous, and interconnected nuclear systems, which, despite their alleged closed nature, offers motivated actors multiple pathways for manipulation and exploitation. For example, the US Minuteman nuclear missile silo. These particular ground-based missiles are believed to be particularly vulnerable to cyber attacks. In addition, nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, once believed to be 100% air-capped and hack-proof, are actually connected by various electromagnetic signals, making them much more susceptible to cyber attacks, especially when they're docked for maintenance, refurbishment, and things like software updates. In addition, these dynamics will increase escalation pressures on states with less robust or less reliable nuclear systems and safeguards, or likely the very same states that have that perceive their survivability or political legitimacy to be at stake. Thinking here of states like North Korea, Pakistan, or even Russia. In short, once a conventional crisis kicks off, the increasingly interdependent and commingled nature of states' conventional and nuclear command and control systems will likely exacerbate the incentives to escalate the situation, either intentionally or probably more likely inadvertently to a nuclear level. Moving on to the third theme in this section. In the digital age, decision makers are exposed to much greater volumes of information, things like satellite imagery, 3D models, geospatial data, and social media intelligence, which during a crisis can create novel attack pathways to propagate campaigns of disinformation. AI augmented technology can act as force multipliers for social manipulation. It can intensify these so-called intergroup competition scenarios, as well as create or enable campaigns of manipulation that fabricate events, create these fictitious situations, or propagate falsehoods. For example, during the Ukraine-Russian conflict, we've seen the use of disinformation tactics involving nuclear rattle sabling by both sides. For example, we saw both the Russian and foreign defense minister make false claims that Ukraine was building a so-called dirty bomb. And more recently, we saw President Zelensky warning Russia that they planted various explosives to deliberately spark a crisis at a Ukrainian nuclear power plant. Worryingly, perhaps, recent social science studies demonstrate that fake images and videos, these so-called deepfakes, can achieve very wide acceptance, even if they can be easily debunked. During a crisis involving two nuclear powers, for example, when communications are compromised or severed, nuclear arsenals are on high alert, decision-making timeframes are compressed, and especially if launch authority of those systems or weapons is pre-delegated. The consequences of these kinds of information operations or cognitive warfare could be catastrophic. A good case in point is the 2019 Indian-Pakistan crisis. And this combined a very toxic mixture of cross-border terrorist attacks, disputed territory, offensive nuclear postures, and escalatory rhetoric playing out on social media. And these threats or this rhetoric included implicit nuclear threats, thus making it very easy to imagine how the actions of a third-party actor could spark accidental nuclear war. In sum, AI augmented technology is rapidly becoming another capability in state and non-states' toolkit to wage campaigns of disinformation and deception, one that both sides in the conflict may have used against them. So to really bring this point home, let's have an illustration here of deepfake disinformation. Machine learning generated deepfakes that is empowered by generative AI, as we're all familiar with now, has added a very new twist to the risk of miscalculation, misperception, and accidental escalation. That, as we know, originates in the virtual world, but can have very real effects in the physical one. Consider the following fictional scenario. To incite conflict between two rivals during a crisis, State A in this case hires proxy hackers to launch a deepfake video depicting senior military commanders of State B conspiring to launch a preemptive nuclear strike on State C. This footage is then deliberately leaked into C's intelligence gathering and analysis systems, putting C under intense pressure to escalate the situation with an unprovoked retaliatory strike. Now B, fearful of a decapitating strike and losing its first mover advantage, responds in kind. Now, while social media platforms have had some limited success in slowing down users' ability to orchestrate these disinformation campaigns, once these operations, obviously turbocharged by bots, go viral, the ability to curtail them is extremely difficult, both for human and machine operators. During the 2019 Indian-Pakistan crisis, and despite Meta's best efforts, fake news and doctored images reached more than 3 million WhatsApp users. So in sum, the increasingly sophisticated and accessibility of disinformation technology, the dual use nature of AI, the problem of attrition in or attribution in cyberspace, and compressed decision making will likely lower the threshold for these so-called false flag information operations and increase inadvertent risk during times of crisis. So given what I said so far, it seems quite sort of clear or self-evident that the employment of AI and autonomy into the nuclear enterprise entails a multitude of trade-offs that really policymakers should cause them to pause to consider how and whether or should AI-powered capabilities, how these technologies might strengthen or complicate stability and deterrence, especially in a very fragile geopolitical nuclear world order. Some examples I can rattle off of these trade-offs include things like ensuring adequate control and supervision of AIs to mitigate escalation risk, while exploiting the benefits of increased lethality, scale, and speed that is obviously afforded by AI. Assimilating AI into force structure and doctrine, while mitigating the danger posed by machine speed and reduced levels of human meaningful control of nuclear weapons. And designing algorithms that support nuclear systems with sufficient knowledge of things like the law of engagement and other legal and ethical normative warfaring frameworks, without, of course, degrading the capacity of these machines to predict and respond to threats. In other words, today policymakers face significant contradictions, dilemmas, and trade-offs about whether and how to integrate AI and autonomy into the nuclear enterprise, which must be examined in the context of a broader quest for deterrence, stability between states, and broader non-proliferation goals. Just to wrap things up here, so I guess this begs a question, all these risks we've highlighted, what can be done to manage these risks? Now, I've broadly, roughly broken these lines of risk reduction into 4 broad areas. First, enhancing the safety of nuclear weapons and hardening nuclear systems and processes. For example, safeguards and risk assessments to strengthen nuclear systems against especially cyber attacks. Second, improving command and control protocols and mechanisms. For example, adding increased redundancies, enhancing launch protocols and launch authentication codes. Thirdly, designing more robust safeguards to contain the consequences of errors and accidents when they inevitably occur. Things like personnel training and the collective monitoring of events. In this area, wargaming or tabletop simulations and other exercises could also be helpful. And finally, and more broadly, modifying existing arms control and verification approaches, innovating new norms and behavior in the use of AI systems, as well as encouraging more bilateral and multilateral confidence building measures and stability dialogue on disruptive immersion technology. I'll leave the discussion there, and we can obviously discuss some of these measures more in the Q&A session. Thank you everyone for your time, and large parts of this research is still very much work in progress, so I look forward to any comments and questions and feedback you may have. I'll hand back to Chloe.
Perfect, thank you so much for that. I've got to say, I feel like my brain has had like a proper workout there with following everything. So yeah, if people do have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. So like I said, that's the kind of little speech bubble. Oh, fantastic. So first question from Tom. You highlighted decision makers' dependence upon data, which is reminiscent of coalition missteps in Afghanistan and Iraq that were based upon the US Air Force's commitment to rapid, decisive operations and transformation concepts like system of systems analysis and PMESII. Did your research incorporate any review of the situation? And if so, have you seen any indication that those seeking to incorporate AI into nuclear decision-making architecture have learned any lessons from prior shortcomings of data-heavy decision, is it matrices? No problem. I'm glad I've hopefully ran through that all okay. So yes, over to you, Jim.
Yeah, I think I can address that. I haven't done any specific work on Iraq per se and Afghanistan, given I'm looking at specifically the interaction between nuclear armed powers, or especially where one state has nuclear weapons, the other one doesn't. For example, we're seeing the situation in Ukraine and Russia, so that's obviously been a key kind of case study and focus. North Korea has been another focus of mine. Some of these so-called rose states, including Iran as a potential breakout nuclear power. So I haven't looked at these systems per se in the Iraqi context. I know the UK MOD is pursuing, or rapidly, as other states are doing, integrating AI technology into command and control structures. That obviously, some of these being dual-based, you're probably aware of, that is some of these systems inform both nuclear capabilities and conventional capabilities. This is something that the DoD in the US and the MOD is rapidly pursuing, some of that being in coordination. And you can read some of the activities that involve Middle Eastern, specifically systems and engagement and work with the US and the UK on the latest AI strategy report that was produced this year, actually, or summary of it by the UK MOD. In terms of the actual second part of your question, I've probably got more to say on that. Is, I guess, the question you're if my understanding is correct, is looking at is whether things like nuclear close calls or accidents are likely to be increased, or the risks increased by the infusion of AI technology into these systems. And I argue there's obviously a double-edged sword in the sense of whether AI can increase or decrease the risk of nuclear use. On the decrease side of the ledger, things like obviously AI can have very stabilizing effects. It can obviously improve human decision making. It can give commanders more decision making time and time for deliberation. Things like time for preemption decisions, crisis diplomacy, target protection. It can also reduce human error. Obviously, although AIs aren't perfect, I think the equivalence that has been drawn that AI must do things to a perfect level, I think is incorrect. I think AIs, if they can do things as good as humans or in increasingly cases a lot better. But I think that should be a more of an accurate kind of barometer. And obviously the potential to reduce human error, things like, AIs don't get emotional, they don't get tired or upset, and these kind of issues that obviously affect humans in combat scenarios, as well as various mental conditions or mental afflictions that we've seen in combat. These are obviously reduced with the infusion of AI, and obviously potentially it can improve cyber defenses. On the risks of increasing nuclear close calls or nuclear accidents, obviously, as discussed in the presentation, things like technical limitations or vulnerabilities of AI. We're all aware of now the explainability problem or the bias that's inherent, or the potential vulnerability to cyber attacks is one area, as well as the challenge in human-machine interaction that I argue in this book, but especially more in my forthcoming book on the AI Commander, is going to be a big problem. And I think this does increase some of the risks we've seen of human and machines interacting, and the result of this interaction being humans kind of loaf off or give these machines more responsibility they're entitled to in a particular situation, and then machines basically going off and doing things with albeit predetermined objectives, but perhaps less supervised or less meaningful control than perhaps would be desired. But thanks for the question.
Thank you. I'm just waiting to see if any more questions come in, because like I said, we do still have time. Or Tom, if you've got any more questions, please feel free to pop them in. I guess maybe on my own. Oh, hey, go for it, Tom. If you've got some more questions, then please feel free to. Well, I was just going to actually ask. You mentioned also that you've kind of been focusing maybe more on like Russia and North Korea. What made you kind of pick those countries and regions in particular?
Yeah, given the kind of time hiatus between when you submit a manuscript and when the book hits the publishing press and the shelves, if you're familiar with the process, it's quite frustrating. So there's a good year between submission and publication. In the meantime, you can't really do much apart from very minor edits. So at the time, most of this predates the Ukrainian-Russian crisis. There is some stuff in there that I had on obviously the Crimean invasion in 2014, but obviously the case studies up to that point were quite thin on the ground. So I did use particular incidents or of nuclear proliferation or potential hotspots or power kegs within the nuclear domain. And the ones obviously that sprang to mind from a post-Cold War point of view are especially when we saw the rattle sabering between Donald Trump around 2017, 2018, and the North Korean regime, as well as potential skirmishes that have been ongoing in the Taiwan Straits and South China Seas, all involving nuclear powers with nuclear neighbors, as well as incidents in India and Pakistan, were my go-to case studies for illustration. Also, my second book looked very closely at the US-China strategic relationship, and obviously US-China being not only superpowers or the main superpowers within the AI space, but obviously US being the biggest possessor of nuclear weapons globally, and China obviously being close behind now in a third position, just behind obviously Russia and the US obviously still dominating 90% plus of nuclear warheads. So that's the main rationale going back a couple of years now.
Thanks. Okay, our next question. Is there a risk of AI decision making becoming based too much on fake news, unreliable information? If AI can't distinguish between fact and fiction, how can human decision makers ensure that the information fed to AI is factual/reliable?
Yeah, this is a big problem. I mean, not only in the nuclear realm, the military realm, but obviously, self-driving cars and the medical profession and legal profession, every area where every domain where AI is having an impact at a societal and economic level is obviously, especially when we're talking about these critical safety areas like obviously military, where human lives are involved, as well as the health care as well. So the unreliability and the fake news and the potential risk of manipulation, as well as the potential or the likelihood that these AIs at this stage in the game hallucinate or make things up. And there's obviously a large bias problem that creates a lot of ethical problems, perhaps less relevant in the military domain, but obviously the soundness of information, the reliability, the robustness, as well as given the potential unreliability of these potential technologies, then obviously the trust that human decision makers afford them is obviously affected greatly. And the new buzzword is this kind of meaningful control, how we can establish meaningful control over AIs. From a technical point of view, as we see with the new Chat GPT and other AI generative systems, these large languaging processing systems, they don't really care about, fact or truth. They're essentially probabilistic statistical models that just blurt out or predict the next sentence or the next fact based on this treasure trove or based on what they can scrape from the internet up until a certain cutoff date, which in the case of ChatGPT is still 2021. So, we are seeing major issues of separating fact from fiction. And I think there's probably a large combination of both that we're seeing in information that's generated, how we can increase the provenance of the information. And I think it's very much going to be a cat and a mouse kind of game. That is, on the defensive side, you've got these fact checkers, largely human, working with machines to try to fact check and obviously stamp out any fake news that comes on board, and conspiracies and other kind of malicious or more outrageous comments in the social media space, as well as on the other side, we've got these nefarious non-state actors that I mentioned in the discussion, who are obviously trying to manipulate the system, pump out fake information for various objectives, and obviously in the military space, use things like deep fakes and cyber warfare to create these information or misinformation campaigns to obviously improve their own lot and smear their opponent. And we've seen this on both sides in the Ukrainian Russian conflict at both levels, not only involving nuclear weapons, but obviously involving deep fakes, some of them being quite laughable. But as I mentioned, even deep fakes that are laughable, we saw Donald Trump being dragged off by security team. We saw fake deep fake generated photographs of the Pentagon be under attack, I think, or on fire a year or so ago. All of these were easily debunked, but at the time they still caused a bit of outrage, and they still affected things like the US stock market in that time. So they still have effects, even if they can be easily proved to be false. I think that's the kind of main problem we're facing. And one other point to mention is that we know AI technology is not just a US or a military classifying information only used within the military the military arena. That is to say, AI like cyber is a dual use technology that is coming from, mostly innovation now, and the funding is coming from the commercial area. So obviously it requires the military, if the technology is going to be used at a military level, to cooperate closely with the commercial area, who obviously have very different safeguards and parameters and ethical controls to ensure that military use AI is used with meaningful control, it's reliable and robust. And I think we're still quite a way away from that kind of objective at the moment. But thanks for your question.
Thank you.
We've got a few more.
I've got a couple more. So the next one is, as states modernize their weapon stockpiles, does artificial intelligence increase the efficiency of these systems in terms of streamlining development?
Modernizing stockpiles. Just to clarify, you're talking about the modernization of nuclear weapons and nuclear stockpiles and physical material, and whether perhaps AI can be used to as a security means to protect or physically protect the security of these systems, or perhaps used as a as a solution to securing these stockpiles. That's something I've discussed in my research, and I think is definitely a viable solution. That is, instead of looking AI purely as a kind of in a negative light, obviously considering or thinking about AI as a possible solution to some of these risks that I've highlighted. And one of them is to use AI technology together with things like data analytics and geospatial work to ensure the safety, both physical safety and the software of used in the nuclear space is to ensure it's it's used safely, to ensure any malware or poison data is obviously picked out by potentially using AI enhanced applications. So in that sense, we can think about AI as being a solution to some of the risks involved in cyber attacks and the potential nefarious use of AI to exploit vulnerabilities or to exploit or pose some of these risks in the nuclear domain. So I think from that point of view, I think there is a good case to be made that AI as a solution to secure physical nuclear material and nuclear weapons, as well as perhaps underwriting or securing some of these non-proliferation and arms control agreements once they're agreed upon, including disarmament agreements, is a strong possibility.
Thank you. Our next one, given financial constraints, are we at risk of increasing AI employment and convincing ourselves of its trustworthiness in defence as a cost-saving measure over human alternatives?
Yeah, this again, I mean, most of these questions go beyond the nuclear space or the military space as a whole. Certainly, there's been there's quite a bit of controversy or these kind of strawman arguments that have discussed AI as stealing jobs. Obviously, it's going to replace certain professions, perhaps create new jobs elsewhere. So people have spoken about AI as being a productivity kind of Cambrian explosion. So again, it's going to increase productivity, perhaps give people more leisure time, reduce some of the more tiring or the more kind of dangerous jobs that humans are involved in, and obviously giving those responsibilities to AI enhanced robotics and other kind of software systems. But I think the cost constraint in a military sense, I think, is less important or less germane than thinking about the cost saving measures over, you mentioned human alternatives. That is, I think the next stage in the trajectory of AI is human machine interaction, which I think is kind of the buzzword now, and people see that as being a short-term panacea before AI operating independently of human supervision is up to speed or considered to be trustworthy or reliable enough to do the job on their own. So a lot of research now, including my own and some wargaming assessments and simulations, have been using or applying human-machine interfaces, both inserted into the brain, which Elon Musk's one of his companies is actively investigating and putting money into. This is this brain interface, as well as considering other alternatives. And I mentioned, because a lot of this AI funding is coming from these big bulge bracket tech firms, I think the financial constraints are less of a concern. I think trustworthiness, meaningful control, ethical concerns, especially in these safety critical domains like the military area, is more of a concern than potential cost saving. And some colleagues that I've spoken to do suggest that we are looking to see a productivity explosion when AI moves into its next stage of iteration, which again could be a major cost saving, and perhaps release, as I mentioned, some of these more arduous and less attractive jobs.
Thank you. Sorry, I was just listening to a delivery driver appear at my house and go away again. So the next question is: a scenario of the Doomsday weapon attack, as in Dr. Strangelove, now more likely if an AI system, given it now more likely if an AI system, I think, is given control in the event of a nuclear state losing or command control center being destroyed.
Just trying to clarify the question in my own head, sorry. So I guess the question here, John, is whether a Doomsday machine, which is essentially an automated launch system, the Doctor Strangelove, if you're familiar with that kind of parody or movie during the Cold War era, is obviously a kind of a spoof. The whole point of having this automated launch decision was that it was secretive. That is, the US didn't realize that the Soviets had this machine that if, for example, communications were cut off or the Soviets were subject to a preemptive strike by the US or even the threat of one, this system would automatically trigger a nuclear reaction. And this system would be unable to be recalled by the Soviet commanders and essentially be out of their control. But I think the kind of main pun or the main point of the ludicrousness of this Doctor Strangelove or this Doomsday machine was that the US was not aware that this machine existed. So we know in Deterrence, unless the threats are credible and obviously they're known or signaled to the adversary, they're pretty much useless. So I think if we have anything that resembles a Doomsday machine, it's pretty much 100% in the negative bucket, given it has no deterrent utility, and deterrent is ultimately the purpose of nuclear weapons, and obviously it has the risks that the weapon can't be recalled, even if it's triggered accidentally. For example, if the Russian alert systems are spoofed, for example, or they're subject to cyber attacks, or perhaps we saw in the deep fake scenario, human leaders are manipulated or forward into triggering these systems, then perhaps we could see a catalytic kind of chain of reaction that humans would be unable to prevent or recall. So one suggestion I would have for a recommendation, if these automated systems, and I think at this stage, most states, there is a general consensus that an automated launch decision-making system where humans are completely out of the loop is a fundamentally bad idea. Whether that consensus holds, that's an open question. I know Russia is still tinkering around with their Cold War era Doomsday, or they call it the kind of dead hand system. That's still very much alive. The US is aware of it. The operational ability of the system is unknown, but there is believed to be human involvement at the launch decision that is given to the tactical leaders in this decision. So a pure Doomsday machine scenario is unlikely. And I think in this case, the ability to recall a nuclear weapon, if it's triggered automatically, I think is essential. And as the UK in their latest AI strategy have mentioned, the ability to have human political control in any nuclear decisions is obviously critical when it comes to enmeshing AI into nuclear systems at various levels, and that's been done in the US and Russia and China as well at certain levels and degrees.
Thank you. Our next one. In war planning, has or is AI being used for calculating and suggesting nuclear strikes against an opponent's force or value targets? If so, then given some AI's tendency to hallucinate, have any novel or unusual options been identified?
Great question. I believe Tom is one of my students, so we'll be discussing this a lot more in lecture 8 and 9. Not to steal my own thunder there, but certainly war planning. I think that's the key aspect of this question: war planning, simulation, war gaming. And I did run a newly debuted war gaming club now as part of the strategic studies within the university. This is a great forum that is these simulations, these war gaming scenarios, whether classified in a military sense or declassified, to really think about, experiment with these different scenarios in a reasonably safe environment, test some of these AI tools, perhaps put AI against AI, consider how adversaries might react to AIs. And I think the question of haves and have-nots is an important thing. So if you're using, the latest technical whiz-bang AI against a state such as North Korea or Iran that doesn't have these systems, or perhaps has raging survivability questions that I mentioned, or has inferior technology or non-robust nuclear systems. And I think these potential risks are, important. And I think attacks on value strikes and force structures and how states will react, even without AI, is obviously something that war planning and simulations and other tabletop exercises can do. And we discussed in class this notion of the tendency of AIs to hallucinate or make things up or fill in their knowledge gap is obviously a key issue as well. And I think that's why a lot of senior military personnel in the US and the UK have obviously highlighted the problem with these new language models, especially the hallucination area. And I think they're very much keeping an arm's length from these technologies anywhere close to, nuclear weapons or even the military domain as a whole, aside from these, closely monitored testing environment areas. And I think that's one area. These red gaming or war gaming is certainly an area that I think is has a lot of potential to test out some of these scenarios. Thanks, Mike, for signing on. Have a good day.
So yeah, if there are any, I'll just kind of pause a little bit to see if they're okay. Perfect. It's long, so apologies if I stumble whilst I read this out, but since circa 2002, the United States has publicly communicated its intent to lean on precision strike as an alternative to tactical nuclear weapons. And part of this calculus has been the investment in anti-ballistic missile capabilities. Do you see an intermediate role for AI in nuclear defense, such as ABM or civil resilience operations? By the way, Russia has 700 more or minus 700 more declared warheads than the United States. Not sure how that sorts out in terms of comparative combined yields.
Good stuff. I think the first part of your question is probably more of a comment. That's good to see. That's useful information as well. You seem to be using more military jargon than myself. So obviously you've got that background. I'll try and do what I can to kind of jargonize some of these comments. But certainly the precision strike capability you mentioned, this is this kind of global positioning strike that we saw rolled out during the Obama era. We don't see any chance of that being, or possibility of that being rolled out or retracted by the US. So certainly they're pursuing both long strike conventional tactics alongside tactical nuclear weapons, which again Russia's pursuing aggressively. China's believed to be the same as well. You mentioned that obviously Russia has more declared warheads. I imagine more of those are going to be in a tactical bucket. That is more short-term war fighting usable weapons rather than the kind of deterrence long-term ones, which obviously we know nuclear weapons were initially designed for. Those of you who've seen the excellent Oppenheimer movie will be aware the initial reaction and motivations for designing nuclear weapons. Again, is something I discuss quite a bit in the course that I'm running this semester. But certainly, whether tactical nuclear weapons are part of the calculus, I think they are part of the calculus. They're increasing part of the calculus. We saw the nuclear doctrine released by the US in 22. Again, there's more of a focus there on these tactical, more flexible nuclear options. And again, all of these are potentially fused with AI technology and the like. Russia is believed to be pursuing a tactical cruise missile that is potentially tipped with nuclear weapons there, as well as a submarine autonomous nuclear weapon they're also building. Obviously, in terms of anti-ballistic missiles, this is a anti-or defense use missiles against incoming nuclear strikes, missile defense. These again could be fused with AI technology. It's something that the US is pursuing, China and Russia as well. And again, On the stability side of things, we can obviously see AI into defense, missile technology, improving guidance, improving intelligence, increasing the scope and the time for decision making. These are obviously all positives for stability. But at the same time, I mentioned before, the haves and the have-nots. If, for example, a Korea or Russia or Iran that has less sophisticated or perhaps has their resources allocated or used elsewhere against a very powerful US or China rivalry that is using these AI-infused defense weapons, then I think again this is going to complicate things for stability and potentially have these so-called use them or lose them situations whereby leaders are forced into a corner and then use nuclear weapons when they're perhaps advised not to, or perhaps they're doing these out of fear and panic or out of survival rather than pure deterrence reactions or rational reactions. Well, thanks, Tom, for your question.
Thank you as well for answering that and for answering all the other questions. If there aren't any more, I'm kind of like pausing, seeing if anything pops in. But if there aren't any more, and Tom's saying thanks for your thoughtful answers. Yeah, if there aren't any
Thanks,
more,
Tom. Thanks, Thomas.
we can probably draw that to a close. So yeah, thank you so